The last time that a queer movie came out and impacted me so drastically that I felt the need to make a main channel video on it, it was a celebration of queer joy. That will not be the case this time. I did very seriously consider doing the entire review with that lighting. I'm not going to, just because it's gonna bug me. And maybe I would have done it if this was a video that was gonna have a lot of cutaways, a lot of additional footage. It's not, partially because I don't want to give away too much of the visual beauty of this movie. And while I will have a spoiler section eventually, I really for the people who see this and make the decision to see I Saw the TV Glow, I want to start by saying you are best served by watching it with as little foreknowledge as possible. This is a movie that I knew a little about. I knew that it had queer themes in it. I knew that it was made predominantly by queer people. And I knew that every trans person on my Twitter feed that saw it both sang its praises and seemed profoundly affected in a very I need to go lay down for a bit way. My own tweet that I did after seeing this simply said, I saw the TV Glow, and I'm not okay. I will be okay, but I'm not right now. And that's a pretty accurate summation. It's a movie that is beautiful and has a profound understanding of queerness, as one might expect from its creators involved both in front of and behind the camera. But in addition to that, it is a lot to process. It is a movie that I would recommend watching early in the afternoon so that you have the rest of the evening to process and decompress. Don't watch this right before going to bed. It's going to fuck up your night. That is the shortest way that I would care to explain it. And I would say if you are comfortable going and watching it, understanding it is a heavy but worthwhile experience of watching, if that's enough to sell you, I would encourage you to go watch it right now, if you can. It's currently available for digital rental, as well as purchase, if you want to go ahead and make a blind buy on my recommendation. I don't like the idea that I have that kind of power, but that is what I would recommend. If you want to hear a little bit more without getting into outright spoilers, well, let's do that. I Saw the TV Glow is a film written and directed by Jane Schoenbrunn. They are a queer creator, and it stars Justice Smith and Bridget Lundy Payne. Not all of these particular performers identify as trans. However, they do all have a queer identity of some form. Lundy Payne is non-binary, while Smith identifies broadly as queer. So there is an inherent queerness involved in this. And I've talked before about the power of queer voices telling queer stories when I talked about Russell T Davies' project, It's a Sin, a few years back. But I'll reiterate it now. This is part of what's really frustrating when trans people get locked out of trans stories. There's a lot of inherent harm in that, but also, especially when the writers, directors, etc. of these projects are also cisgender and frequently straight. And I do make a distinction between that. While I think it is possible for a gay, bisexual, otherwise sexually queer person to have a better understanding of the trans experience, if they are cisgender, there is still going to be a limit. Now, that's not to say that these people cannot ever tell a good story, but they have a lot of hurdles to overcome. Whereas queer people, trans people, and reminder, non-binary is a form of trans. they're both umbrellas. I did an entire video on this on one of my other channels, but non-binary is an umbrella term for people who feel that the normal standards of male or female do not suit them. Now, under that umbrella, there's a ton of individual identities ranging from gender fluid, hi, that's me, where your sense of identity tends to meander a bit. There are people who identify as demi-boys, demi-girls, where when they have a sense of gender, it's mostly this, but not always. There are agender people who are just like, gender? I hardly know her, and just want nothing to do with the entire concept. And that's not even getting into more complicated ideas like two-spirit amongst indigenous populations. But the point is, non-binary is an umbrella. But that umbrella is underneath the larger umbrella of trans, because trans is anyone who does not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. And nobody is assigned non-binary at birth. That is not a thing that happens. So non-binary is an umbrella under the trans umbrella. So I feel like that's worth pointing out just in case, or just to try and head off any arguments about whether or not non-binary is trans in my comments, or people think I'm conflating things. Like, no, like they're all under a larger umbrella. And of course, the trans umbrella is under the much larger umbrella of queer. So umbrella under umbrella under umbrella. And yet we still get pissed on by so much of the world. Not kink shaming if that's your thing, but consent is key. Why did I go on that tangent? Okay, I got to bring this back. Sorry, I'm trying to find levity where I can because this is a very heavy movie to talk about. The last time I talked about a queer movie to this detail, it was Nimona. And while that movie did, and actually still does, I've watched it within the last few weeks, still does make me cry, it also brings me great, immense joy. That's not the experience of this movie. This movie is set across actually a fairly lengthy stretch of time, but it begins in 1996, which makes it geared very much not just for queer people, but for queer millennials in specific. I actually would have been the age that the character of Maddie is, making me only about 2 years older than Owen. And we start with just this young boy who just seems to kind of be drifting through his life. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of doubt, and he feels a draw towards a TV show called The Pink Opaque, which is, let's just go heavily Buffy the Vampire Slayer coded, and I mean heavily. Not that it is meant to be necessarily a parody or a one-to-one match. There's actually quite some significant differences as we learn more about what this TV show contained. But, like, let me put it this way. It is something aimed at a young adult demographic that appears to be quote-unquote for girls because it has female leads. It has a surprising amount of deep lore, an awful lot of themes, to the point that there are published works about it, like episode guides and things exploring it. And when we see the start of one of these episodes, the credits font, if it's not the exact same, and I don't mean like the title, but the title sequence, but I mean the credits that would come up after the title on a Buffy episode, if it's not the exact same font, it is really, really close. And there's a cameo midway through the movie that absolutely cements this connection. And it's a cameo that is beautiful and tasteful and made me cry just for about 10 seconds of film. A lot of this movie made me cry, but the nature of those tears changed because the nature of the story changes. Owen connects with Maddie, who is a couple years older than him, and she openly loves the Pink Opaque, whereas Owen does not feel safe to openly express the joy that he feels and the connection that he finds with that show. We have a very quick moment in the car early on that says a lot of his father saying to him, "Isn't that a show for girls?" His father, played by Fred Durst, of all people, who actually does a pretty good job. Actually, everybody does a good job in this. I think if I'm going to single out anybody, it's going to be Justice Smith. What Smith is able to bring to this part is this beautiful listlessness. He speaks reservedly, slowly, nervously, in a way that under other circumstances I might find frustrating. He has very little understanding of how best to express himself and how to build the connections that he's feeling. But he feels connected to this show, and he feels connected to Maddie. And as that connection builds, there is so much beauty and so much hope. Where it goes from there, I'm going to put like my first spoiler warning. I'll give you the warning before I get into flat out, absolute considered spoilers, but I'm layering this. Here's my first spoiler warning because I need to talk thematically about how things change in the back half. And I think not knowing might make for a better viewing experience for you if you're still here and haven't seen it yet. Well, actually, let me back up. I'd seen the movie described as a horror drama, and while there were horror elements, like, honestly, it felt like it was horror in the same way that Buffy the Vampire Slayer was horror. There's some horror theming, some horror tones, some horror imagery, but would we call this horror? Back half, yes it is. Yes it is. And not in some ridiculously gory, visceral way. It is emotionally horrifying, this movie. The way that it does that shift and proceeds into its back half as things continue down a path that could have been very exploitative. And by exploitative, I mean it could have been mining queer pain for a cheap pop of sympathy or, oh, gotcha, or knife twisting. And it's not any of that. I think it holds true to the idea that nobody can hurt you as well as somebody who understands you. And again, to the benefit of this being made by queer creators, they understand queer pain. And they are able to portray it in a way that recognizes it, validates it, and does not feel like it is displaying it for entertainment, even though in the most literal possible sense, that is what it is doing. But it just never feels exploitative. Now, before I get into proper spoilers, because I need for myself, if nothing else, I need to unpack the back half of this movie in detail. But the queer themes of this are central to it. And I have looked at the things that have been said by Jane Shobran, and the queer themes that I saw were very much what it was about. They've been very upfront about that. That having been said, I don't want anyone to think that if you are not queer, there's nothing to be gained from this. Out of morbid curiosity, I did look around for some other reviews for some other folks. For instance, I took a look at the review made by Chris Stuckman. Now, Chris Stuckman is queer, to be fair. He came out as pansexual a number of years ago. I actually talked about that at the time as part of a larger video about big name creators coming out. The reason I'm still going to bring him up is that when he talks about what connected him to this movie, he talks about media and technological nostalgia, and that the movie still greatly impacted him through that lens. Even though he didn't apply a queer lens to it, he still found a lot of meaning of it. And honestly, this is true of most heavily queer-themed pieces of art. Queer theming, trans theming in particular, the idea of my life is wrong, my life isn't what it should be, that is something that's going to resonate well beyond the trans community. That's at the core of every single animated Disney film that opens with an I Wish song. So these themes can absolutely connect beyond a queer or specifically trans audience. But I think what this movie does to speak to and about trans people and trans audiences is something beautiful and horrifying. This is your final spoiler warning. The nature of the pink opaque takes on a new meaning as the piece goes on. Maddie vanishes at the halfway mark. And when she returns some years later, no longer wishing to be called Maddie, she describes that the pink opaque is not just a show. And that the connection she felt to the character of Tara and the connection that Owen felt to the character of Isabel isn't just recalling a likeness or just seeing like, I'm a little bit like that. That is who they actually are. And they were trapped, defeated, had their hearts cut out, were buried alive by the villain of that show, Mr. Melancholy. And they were trapped within the nightmare realm, which is their current reality. Maddie then tries to bring, I can't keep calling her Owen, tries to bring Isabel out. But coming out of this nightmare realm is traumatic. What it requires, what it took for Tara, because I don't feel comfortable keep calling her Maddie, what it took for Tara to get out was to be buried alive. To literally bury the life that she was trapped in order to be reborn as who she actually is. And there's a lengthy description of that experience that in a lesser movie would have felt like an absolute drag of a scene, and it doesn't. It is harrowing, just having it described. She brings Isabel, or tries to bring Isabel out to go through this, to escape the nightmare realm, to return to where they're supposed to be the pink opaque. And Isabel runs away. When that happened initially, I wasn't shocked, but I was like, okay. Well, we're gonna have to pick up on this again later. It doesn't really. There's a fourth wall break where Isabel says that she never saw Maddie again. And she becomes an adult. She says that she has a family. We never see them. She gets a job at an arcade and continues to work it as her physical health deteriorates further and further and further. She never leaves. She stays in the nightmare and never leaves. And if you haven't gathered already that the nightmare is having to live the mask and the lie that you are what you were assigned at birth, that you are what the world has insisted that you are, instead of being your true self, that is what's going on. This movie is about how not taking that horrifying and terrifying and traumatic leap into the life you were supposed to have will kill you slowly. And that's the end. When I tell you that I pleaded with this movie to not do what it was doing, I'm not going to say I've never said out loud while watching a movie, oh, don't do that. I have, but generally it's been in response to a plot turn I didn't like, or the introduction of like a certain aspect of storytelling. I'm like, oh, don't do that. Like it feels like an injection of something I don't want into a story I was enjoying. That's not what this was. When I tell you that I had tears streaming down my face and my voice was choked and I was out loud begging and pleading for this story to not be what it was. But it's also what this story needed to be. Because we don't all get out. We don't all escape. And I think it's very important that the ability of Isabel to, well, I suppose the inability of Isabel to leave is not imposed from without. The circumstances of her life absolutely is. Imposed by a horrifying villain to live a life that is literally suffocating her. That is imposed from without, but the choice to not leave it is still ultimately hers. This is incredibly well handled. Notions of courage and the need for it are introduced very early into the movie. And Isabel can't bring herself to do it. But what I appreciate is that is not displayed as a failing on like an objective level of her as a person. The problem isn't that she's scared, but that it was that fear that prevented her, because thanks to the incredible description of what it was that Tara went through, it makes sense that she's scared. The idea of burying the person that you have been, that is a terrifying idea. And it is scary. And it stops a lot of people. And it makes them not make that choice, not be reborn as who they're supposed to be. And it's not a punishment for Isabel that she slowly dies in this nightmare realm that is just the real world. It's not a punishment, it's a tragedy. And it's incredibly layered. Because I suppose one could make the argument that Tara should have gone back and tried again, but I would say that there's only so many times for your own well-being that you can return to a place, both either physically or emotionally, that is damaging to you, and try and pull somebody else out of it. There's only so many times you can do that before it really starts to harm you. So I don't think it's a mistake or a condemnation of Tara that she didn't go back and try again. But there's also this shot with Isabel walking home over chalk writing on the ground that says, "There's still time." I want to physically hug this movie for putting that there, because it's making such an important point that the absence of could erect this movie, which is that it's not a matter of missing your one window. Speaking as someone who didn't start transitioning until the latter half of their 30s, and seeing people get so worried that it's too late for them, there's still time. That is literally always true. If you are still breathing, there is still time. It is never too late to be yourself. And I've said elsewhere, I'm not afraid of aging anymore. I used to be. My 20s, my early 30s. I was afraid of aging. I'm 42 now. I love my gray hair, because I get to age as me. The reason getting old scared me, I have come to realize in hindsight, is I was afraid I was going to get old as someone who I didn't want to be. There's still time. It's not too late. And it is beautiful that that message is there, and it is tragic that Isabel walks over it. It takes a lot of understanding, a lot of compassion to tell a story this painful, this well. Because this hurt. This shook me, this hurt me, this broke me. And I am grateful for that. Because we don't all make it out. And while there is always hope, hope can and does go unfulfilled. And that doesn't mean we ignore the stories of the people who don't get out. That doesn't mean that we pretend they don't exist. That doesn't mean we only celebrate our successes. We recognize those who are trapped. We recognize those who are slowly dying, smothered by a life that is not what theirs was meant to be. This movie is beautiful. I don't just mean thematically, it's visually beautiful. It's a gorgeously constructed film. And while, for very obvious reasons, I glommed onto the queer and trans themings that I feel are very much at the heart of it, there are other ways to read it. There is still ways to connect to that story, even if you yourself aren't trans. It is very easy to still feel smothered by your life because you've taken on a life that felt assigned to you from a very early age, if not birth. If that trajectory is, well, you go into this line of work and you get a career and you get a 401k and you retire and you die. If you feel stifled by that, you'll probably still connect with this story in some way. There are many ways to connect with this, but the inherent transness of it. And to be clear, Isabel, it's not just metaphorically trans. Isabel's pretty explicitly trans. We see flashbacks even within the nightmare realm of her trying on a dress. And it's one of the only times in the entire movie we get even the hint of a smile on her. And that made me cry too. That made me cry. Happy, thinking she's going to find out. And she's going to be who she's supposed to be. But she does find out, but she doesn't live it. And then I cried uncontrollably. And not just because it's a sad story. It's a true story. I don't mean literally this specific narrative, but I mean the heart of what it is telling happens. That could have been me. That is many people currently living. That is many people who are no longer with us. This is their story. So many who have been lost and were never just themselves. And the balancing of the external pressures along with just the self-doubt. There is a condemnation of the outside forces, metaphorically through Mr. Melancholy and more directly through figures like Isabel's father. There are pressures from without to conform and not be what you're supposed to be. And when I say supposed to, I don't mean by their standards. I mean by who you are meant to be, who you really are. But it also embraces the tragedy of people making the choice to stay in the nightmare. And again, there's no catharsis to that. Isabel isn't being rightfully punished for hubris or some other classical tragic hero failing. She has resigned herself to a slow suffocation. But again, it doesn't berate her as a coward. The movie acknowledges how scary it is. And it's not an unreasonable thing for people to be too scared to do it. But it is still tragic and heartbreaking. This movie is a phenomenal piece of work that I don't think I can say enough things about. And I'm certain that there either already are or will be other queer creators who will give you a much more thorough dissection of the analysis and the themes and the homages and the influences and everything else going on, because there's a lot to unpack. But I didn't want to sit down and get over analytical with this. Not right now. I could at a later point, but right now, this hit me so hard, emotionally, directly in that way. That is the experience I wanted to speak to. I didn't want to dwell on shooting techniques and framing and dissecting the analysis and the metaphor and where exactly this comes from, and this is related to this, and this is this sort of technique, and here are these additional themes brought in. Like, that's all worth doing, but what I wanted to share with you is how this thing hit me like a freight train. It hit me where I live, and as much as it hurt, I'm grateful for it. Thank you very much for your time. Have you seen I Saw the TV Glow? Or did you just want to hear me talk about it and didn't care about spoilers? I hope if you did want to see it without spoilers, you did so without watching the rest of this. But whatever your thoughts are on this, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon is what enables me to do this as my living. And any amount that you can help there is of immense importance, and I appreciate every single bit. But even if you can't, there's likes, shares, subscribes, links to other things I do down in the description. But what I want you to know, and what I need you to remember, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zumila Fulla, Goddess Elida, Trista Ashley, Oliver B., Melissa Peterson, Tarak, The Thing That Goes Going to the Anime, Gene Foray, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Linda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernambilax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Dave Hall, White Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Pal Barabajoggle, Lucy Wood, Dorm Mayhew, and Mira G. Thank you for your support, and consider supporting me as well on Patreon.